The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked between overdue bills and grocery coupons I hadn't asked for. I almost threw it away until I saw the thick cream envelope and the embossed gold initials, AMC. I didn't know anyone with those initials, but it felt expensive, heavy in a way junk mail never was. I slid it open with a butter knife, expecting some kind of legal warning, maybe another debt collector. What I found instead was a name I hadn't heard in years, and a sentence that stole the breath from my lungs. You have inherited the full estate of Annabelle Marie Kavanaugh. Before I continue narrating the story of Claire Dalton, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. I sat on the worn kitchen chair for what must have been half an hour, just staring at those words. Annabelle was my mother's estranged sister, a woman who disappeared from family conversations sometime around 1995. My mother said she'd chased luxury and loneliness in equal measure, abandoning tradition to start her own fashion label and eventually moving to Europe. I had never met her, not that I remembered, but her name still floated around like a ghost at holiday dinners. And now she had left me, Claire Dalton, everything she owned. The next page of the letter listed the estate's estimated value, $13.2 million in assets. I felt a hot flush climb my neck as I read it, as if someone had caught me in the middle of a crime I didn't understand. Attached was a name and number for a legal contact in Boston, a firm I'd never heard of, but with a logo so crisp it looked airbrushed. I reread the figure twice, thinking it must be a typo, that someone had added an extra digit somewhere. But no, there was again in the summary. Investments, properties, luxury items, and a holding account already transferred to my name. I gripped the countertop to keep from sliding off the chair. My first thought was to call Brian, my husband of 6 years, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I closed the envelope, placed it neatly on the dining table, and made myself tea with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The radiator clanged beside me like it did every morning in our cramped apartment, the windows still fogged from last night's cold. Brian had already left for work without a word, same as usual, his coffee half drunk, and sink full of dirty dishes a kind of signature. It struck me even then how strange it was to inherit a fortune while living like a ghost in your own marriage. We hadn't always been like this. Once Brian had held my face in both hands and promised me the world beneath a sky full of stars in Yosemite, but years of disappointment had hollowed us out. His rejected business pitches, my miscarried dreams of opening a bookstore, our shared silence filling the space between us like fog. We worked opposite shifts now. He managed a failing electronics store. I cataloged medical records in a back room that smelled like bleach. Neither of us had the energy to fix what had broken. We didn't argue anymore, just floated past each other like roommates who forgot to say goodbye. That afternoon, I sat across from the estate lawyer, Mr. Langdon, in a leather chair that made a soft whoosh when I shifted. He was older than I expected, silver hair perfectly parted, his voice the kind of polish that made you feel small. Your aunt was particular, he said, handing me a glass of water I didn't ask for. She requested the transfer be immediate and unconditional. My fingers curled around the cool glass like it might anchor me in reality. She didn't leave a message? I asked, still unsure if this was some elaborate joke. Langdon tilted his head, then reached into a folder and pulled out a handwritten note on stationery that smelled faintly of lavender and age. Miss Dalton, it read, I chose you because you were the only one who never wanted anything from me. Spend it or don't. But understand that money is never free. That was it. No fondness, no family sentiment, just cold instruction and warning. The drive home felt like walking underwater. Boston shimmered around me, busy and bright, but I felt detached from all of it. I rode the subway with the letter tucked inside my coat, gripping it like it might vanish. I watched strangers text and scroll, drink overpriced coffee, and carry yoga mats into studio doors with chalkboard signs out front. None of them knew that someone among them had just become a multi-millionaire without lifting a finger. I wondered if anyone could see it in me, if I looked different now, heavier with possibility. Brian was home by the time I returned, his feet on the coffee table, a beer half drunk, and news murmuring from the TV. You're late, he said without looking up. Traffic, I lied, shrugging off my coat with a clatter. He didn't ask anything else, didn't notice the tightness in my voice or the way my fingers twitched toward the envelope in my purse. Dinner? He muttered. I nodded and stepped into the kitchen, where the faucet leaked in a steady rhythm that had started to sound like a ticking clock. I thought about telling him. I really did, but then he made that sound again. The disapproving sigh he used when I spoke too long, or laughed too hard, or did anything he considered extra, and I couldn't do it. Not yet. I wanted the news to be mine a little longer, something sacred before it was dissected and judged. Instead, I cooked us pasta and said nothing. He complained about a coworker who used his mug again, about the manager who refused to order new displays. I nodded through it all, stirred sauce, and tucked the letter deeper into my purse. The inheritance didn't feel real yet, like maybe I'd dreamed it during one of those lucid naps I took between cataloging patient charts. But it was there, tucked into bank accounts and legal language, waiting. And I had no idea what to do with it. That night I lay awake beside Brian, watching the ceiling through streetlight-filtered shadows. His back was to me, his breathing deep and even, unaware of the tectonic shift that had just cracked beneath our life. I counted the years between me and Annabelle, years of silence, of absence, of stories told in anger or not at all. Why me? What had she seen? I turned the questions over like stones in my mind, searching for edges that made sense. Somewhere around 3 a.m. I rose and slipped into the living room, turning on just one lamp. I pulled the envelope from my purse and stared at it again, half expecting the words to have changed overnight. But they hadn't. The number was still there, bold and final, $13.2 million. I whispered it aloud like a secret, and it sounded foreign coming from my lips. I thought about what I'd do first. A vacation, maybe. Something warm and quiet with oceans instead of deadlines. Or a new apartment, one with tall windows and room to breathe, where the sink didn't leak and the hallway didn't smell like cigarette smoke. Or maybe I'd buy nothing at all. Just save it, hide it. Let it be mine in a way nothing else had ever been. Then I heard Brian stir, a low grunt, and the creak of our old bed frame. I panicked, stuffing the letter back into my bag and flipping the lamp off before he walked in. "Claire?" he called groggily. "Just getting water," I answered, my voice too steady. He grunted again and returned to the bedroom. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't ready to tell him. Not yet. I barely slept the next night, my mind pacing circles around what this money meant and what it could ruin. The apartment felt too small for the thoughts crowding my head, too cold even with the heat rattling through old pipes. When dawn broke, I stared at the ceiling and imagined it collapsing under the weight of secrets I hadn't said out loud. Brian lay next to me, snoring lightly, his arm flung across the bed like a barrier. I knew the moment I told him everything would change. Not just our bank account, but us. Saturday morning came with the sharp smell of burnt toast and a tension I couldn't quite explain. Brian stood shirtless in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, ignoring the smoke curling up from the toaster. "You okay?" he asked without looking up, voice muffled around a sip of coffee. I nodded and lied with a practiced smile. "Just tired." He shrugged and mumbled something about the car needing new brakes, already moving on. I went to the bank that afternoon under the pretense of running errands, heart hammering so hard it echoed in my ears. The account the law firm had transferred the assets into was real, the numbers terrifying in their size, so many zeros they blurred together. The banker, a cheerful man named Evan, congratulated me with a polite professionalism that felt like it belonged to someone else. "You're in a new bracket now," he said, sliding a folder across the glass desk. I smiled, like I understood what that meant, but all I could think about was how heavy the money felt, even when it wasn't in my hands. I left the bank with a temporary debit card tucked in my wallet, feeling like I'd stolen it. Outside, the wind bit through my coat, and I found myself staring at window displays I'd never dared to enter before. Everything glittered more sharply, every surface reflecting back a version of myself that didn't feel real. I could buy anything now. Any dress, any bag, any future. But all I wanted was time to figure out if I'd just inherited freedom or a leash made of gold. That night, Brian asked why I looked like I'd been crying, and I told him it was just the wind. He didn't press, just turned up the volume on the TV and asked if we had any beer left. I watched him from the doorway, wondering how he had become so distant without even trying. There had been a time when we'd made lists of our dreams on napkins in diners, when he'd made me laugh so hard I cried. Now we were cohabiting our silence like tenants waiting out a lease. Sunday morning, I took a walk by myself to the park near the library, the one where we used to sit with coffee cups and talk about what we'd do when things got better. The benches were empty and slick with frost, and the sky hung low like it might collapse under its own gray weight. I sat alone, watching people with strollers and dogs pass, feeling both invisible and exposed. A woman beside me adjusted her daughter's scarf and gave me a tight, polite smile before moving on. I envied her simplicity, the normalcy of her concerns, the fact that she didn't have a secret fortune burning a hole in her spine. When I came back, Brian was on the phone in the bedroom, the door half closed. His voice was low, agitated, and he didn't hear me come in. "I told you I can't make promises yet," he was saying, tone-clipped and defensive. "She's acting weird, but nothing concrete. I'll figure it out." I froze in the hallway, my pulse roaring like a distant siren I couldn't locate. I backed away before he saw me, retreating into the kitchen and turning on the faucet just to make some noise. He emerged a few minutes later, acting normal, asking what I wanted for dinner like he hadn't just betrayed me in whispers. I kept my voice steady, my eyes dry, and said I wasn't hungry. He nodded and grabbed a beer, muttering something about the Patriots game. I stood there, silent, the air between us suddenly a battlefield littered with things unsaid. That night, while he snored beside me, I pulled my laptop onto the couch and started digging. I searched our phone records, something I hadn't done in years, not since before trust had curdled into routine. There were dozens of late-night calls to a number I didn't recognize, all around 2 a.m., always lasting more than 15 minutes. I copied the number into a reverse lookup site, hands trembling. The name that popped up was Lena Hayes, a name I didn't know, but I'd remember it. I didn't sleep at all, not even a little. By morning, I had found her social media, pretty, polished, all soft light selfies and captions about chasing peace. Her account was private, but the profile picture told me more than I wanted to know. Her hand on a wine glass, Brian's reflection faintly visible in the background. I stared at it for so long the image burned into my vision. My stomach churned, not from jealousy, but from the certainty that I'd been living with a stranger for longer than I'd realized. Brian left for work at 8, whistling like nothing was wrong, and I watched him from the window until he disappeared around the corner. I waited 20 minutes before calling the law firm. "Mr. Langdon, this is Claire Dalton," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Can you tell me if anyone else has contacted you claiming a connection to the estate?" There was a pause, paper shuffling, then his voice returned, measured, confused. "Actually, yes. A man named Brian Dalton called last week asking about disbursement timelines. He hadn't even waited a full week before trying to insert himself into my inheritance. I didn't remember telling him about the money, which meant he either guessed or found the letter. Either way, he was already plotting, already laying foundations under my feet before I'd taken my first step. My mouth tasted like metal as I thanked Mr. Langdon and hung up. Outside, the street looked the same, but I had changed in ways I couldn't take back. I went back to the park bench and sat for hours, letting the cold soak into my jeans and bones. I thought about how we met at a friend's New Year's party, how his hands were always warm even in January. I thought about our wedding vows, our apartment, the 6 Christmases spent unwrapping socks and smiles that didn't reach our eyes. Then I thought about Lena Hayes, about the reflection in the wine glass, about the sound of Brian's voice through a cracked bedroom door, and I knew the betrayal hadn't started with money. It had started the moment he decided I was easier to use than to love. I didn't confront him that night, though I rehearsed it dozens of times while making dinner. Brian came home late, smelling like cologne that wasn't his, and carrying the faint guilt of someone who thought they were clever. He complimented the chicken, something he hadn't done in months, and I smiled like I didn't know about Lena Hayes. The way he kissed my cheek, quick, dismissive, absent, told me he believed he still had control. He didn't know I'd already begun dismantling the illusion we'd built together. After he fell asleep on the couch with a half-finished beer, I gathered the things I needed: passports, insurance forms, the deed to the car in my name. I didn't know what I would do with them yet, only that I wanted them somewhere he couldn't touch. I moved quietly, careful not to disturb the creaky floorboards near the hallway. My laptop and the estate documents were already packed in a tote beneath the bed, just in case. I felt like a woman preparing for war in the dark, gathering armor while the enemy slept inches away. The next day, I met with a financial advisor recommended by the law firm, a woman named Grace who wore monochrome suits and had eyes that missed nothing. I liked her instantly, sharp, efficient, and immune to small talk. She reviewed the portfolio Annabelle had left with clinical interest, noting long-term investments, luxury properties in Europe, and a staggering account in Switzerland. "You're liquid enough to disappear if you wanted," she said without judgment. I nodded, the idea of vanishing hovering like fog in my chest. Grace offered to move the majority of my assets into a trust, under a pseudonym, giving me control without visibility. "If someone were looking to manipulate you," she said, flipping through documents, "this makes it significantly harder." I signed every form without flinching, sealing away what Brian had already tried to steal. As I initialed each page, I thought about the phone calls to Lena, the lies, the performance. I thought about how quickly he'd seen my fortune not as a gift to share, but a resource to exploit. I took a cab home, the city flashing past like a slideshow of other people's lives. I didn't recognize the apartment anymore. The chipped paint, the sagging sofa, the heaviness in the air. Every item inside had been filtered through a lens of scarcity for years, a life constructed from discount racks and half-price compromises. And now I had the means to change all of it, but no idea what that would actually feel like. I unlocked the door and stepped into a place that felt more like a trap than a home. Brian was at the table with his laptop, spreadsheets open, calculator in hand, face scrunched in forced concentration. "Hey babe, do you know how much we're still paying on your student loans?" he asked without looking up. I stared at him, wondering if he really thought I'd forget our financial history, or if he was trying to bait me into revealing the money. "Still the same as last month," I said calmly, walking past him to the bedroom. My voice was even, but my hands shook as I closed the door. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and imagined the life I would build without him, the bookstore I'd always dreamed of, the house with windows that let in sun, the silence that didn't feel like punishment. Brian had once told me silence was a form of power, something his father taught him. Back then, I'd thought he meant it kindly, like a way to listen better. Now I understood it had been a warning. I called my best friend Erin the next morning, someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. She was the last person who'd warned me about Brian, the last to believe he wasn't who he pretended to be. "Claire?" she said cautiously when she picked up. "Are you okay?" I hadn't cried yet, but hearing her voice crack something inside me I hadn't known was still whole. We met at a quiet cafe we used to frequent in better years, the kind with mismatched mugs and handwritten menus. Erin looked the same. Freckles, dark curls, eyes that didn't let you lie. I told her everything over coffee that went cold. The inheritance, the secret calls, the lie he told the lawyer. "You're serious," she said slowly, blinking like she was trying to reset her brain. I nodded, and for the first time in days, I felt seen. "He's dangerous," she said eventually, her fingers tight around her mug. "Maybe not in the way that leaves bruises, but in the way that erases who you are one sentence at a time." I nodded because I knew that kind of danger too well. It wasn't the kind that showed up on police reports. It was the kind that convinced you your thoughts were too much and your dreams were too big. "He's not going to stop," Erin continued, pulling out her phone. "So you need to get ahead of him." She helped me contact a lawyer she knew, someone who specialized in asset protection and spousal fraud. I felt the weight of the folder in my purse, the inheritance documents, the bank records, the list of calls to Lena, and knew I had enough. Not just to leave, but to fight, if I had to. Back at the apartment, Brian was waiting on the couch, his phone in hand, expression unreadable. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone light but too controlled. I shrugged, dropped my keys on the table, and said, "Coffee with Aaron." His jaw tensed at the name, but he said nothing. I could see it now, how he calculated every reaction, every word, like a man keeping a ledger. That night, I logged into our joint bank account and watched as another transfer appeared, small, unremarkable, just $90 to a name I didn't recognize. He was still siphoning money, still preparing for something I hadn't yet uncovered. I printed every transaction, photographed every statement, every credit card he tried to open without my signature. It was all evidence now. Every lie was a line on a page I would present to a judge, if it came to that. I kept my phone under my pillow, paranoid that he might try to check it in my sleep. I'd started locking the bathroom door even when I showered, noticing how his footsteps paused outside sometimes, listening. He wasn't violent, but he was watching, waiting for weakness. And now that he suspected I knew something, he was getting careless. That made him dangerous in new ways. On Wednesday, I told him I'd be working late, then left the apartment with my tote bag and a change of clothes. I didn't go to work. I checked into a hotel across town under a different name, paid in cash from the emergency fund I'd started building after I first caught him lying about a credit card. I turned my phone off and slept in a room that didn't smell like regret. In the morning, I ordered breakfast I didn't have to cook and watched the sunrise without fear. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch at shadows. The hotel room was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. No footsteps above me, no pipes groaning in protest, no TV humming in the background. I took a long shower and let the hot water erase the weight of Brian's voice, his expectations, his manipulations. My phone stayed off on the nightstand, a small act of rebellion that felt like armor. I ate eggs on white linen and signed documents from Grace's firm, each one another thread cut from the web I'd been trapped in. When I finally turned my phone back on, there were 13 missed calls from Brian and 2 voicemails that bounced between worried and angry. He didn't know where I was, and that terrified him. The second voicemail was sharper, more frantic, laced with false concern and something colder just beneath. "You can't just disappear," he said, his voice rising. "This isn't how adults handle problems. Call me back, Claire. We need to talk about this like civilized people." I deleted the message and blocked his number. That afternoon, I met with the attorney Aaron recommended, a sharp woman named Kelsey Rowe with a voice like glass and a face that didn't offer sympathy unless you earned it. She reviewed everything I brought, financial transfers, screenshots, copies of emails and call logs, and her frown deepened with each page. "This isn't just a divorce case," she said finally. "This is attempted financial abuse with potential fraud, if we can prove intent. And you're smart to be ahead of it." I signed a retainer agreement on the spot, my name crisp on the dotted line. Kelsey promised to begin paperwork for a protective trust, an expedited separation filing, and a temporary injunction against accessing any shared funds. "He'll try to paint you as unstable," she warned, already drafting strategy notes. "People like him always do, so stay clean, stay careful, and let me handle the fire." I left her office feeling lighter than I had in weeks, like I'd found the exit to a maze I didn't know I was in. Later that night, I stood in front of a mirror and looked at myself like a stranger would. My face was thinner than I remembered, the worry having carved shadows beneath my cheekbones, but there was something new behind my eyes. Clarity. Not joy yet, not peace, but something harder and more useful. I brushed my hair, applied lipstick, and dressed in clean clothes that hadn't been wrinkled from sleeping in corners of my life. I looked like someone reclaiming herself piece by piece. I moved into a rental apartment the next day, a small place above a florist shop with creaky wooden floors and windows that actually opened. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every square foot an exhale I didn't know I needed. The landlord, a cheerful widow named Denise, gave me extra keys and a tour that ended with cookies and unsolicited life advice. "People leave," she said with a wink, "but peace stays if you let it." I smiled and pretended not to cry in her hallway. The estate money stayed untouched except for the trust setup, my rent, and legal fees. I lived modestly on purpose, afraid that extravagance might tether me to the wrong kind of freedom. I wanted to earn my way back to myself, not by a shortcut. I applied for a part-time assistant position at an independent bookstore 3 blocks away, more for structure than income. The owner, a retired teacher named Nadia, hired me on the spot and offered me a mug of mint tea in celebration. Nadia reminded me of who I used to be before Brian, before disappointment rewired my nervous system to flinch at kindness. She gave me hours that worked around my legal meetings and trusted me with inventory on the second day. I found peace in alphabetizing shelves, in recommending novels to people who still believed in stories. I told her only the outline, recent separation, new chapter, starting over, and she never pushed for more. That respect felt like a lifeline, permission to be quiet without being invisible. Meanwhile, Brian grew louder in his absence. He showed up at my old job asking questions, enough to spook my former supervisor into calling me. "He said you might be confused," she told me, her voice tight with discomfort. "That he was worried about your memory, your mental health." I thanked her for telling me and warned her not to give him any more information, then hung up and emailed Kelsey. "He's setting up a narrative," she said grimly when I relayed the conversation. "We'll get ahead of it." She filed for an emergency hearing that same afternoon, requesting a no-contact provision and a block on all joint financial accounts. I didn't ask what might happen if the judge denied it. I trusted her to be 10 steps ahead. Brian didn't know I had a war general in a power suit on my side. 3 days later, I received an email that made my hands go cold. It was from Lena Hayes. Just one sentence, typed in bold with no punctuation. "You don't know the full story." I read it 6 times before closing my laptop and stepping out into the cold evening air. I didn't reply, but I saved the message and sent it to Kelsey. "Do not engage," she warned immediately. "This is bait. She's either working with him or being manipulated. Either way, her motives don't serve you." I obeyed, but her words lingered in my head for days like smoke from a distant fire I couldn't locate. Back at the bookstore, I found comfort in paper and stories again. Customers came and went, asking for mysteries, romances, cookbooks, or just a quiet corner to browse. I recommended titles that matched their moods, slipping into the gentle rhythm of a life built from healing rather than survival. At night, I curled up with novels I used to love before Brian had declared fiction a waste of time. In those pages, I found pieces of myself returning like puzzle fragments I thought I'd lost. Then came the hearing. Kelsey met me at the courthouse in a charcoal suit that made her look like she'd already won. Brian sat across from us with a lawyer who looked fresh out of law school and a face full of fake concern. He tried to smile at me once before Kelsey leaned in and whispered, "Don't give him your eyes. He lives off reactions." I nodded, clutching my coat like a shield. The judge was a no-nonsense woman with silver hair and a sharp gaze that cut through the courtroom's posturing. She listened to both sides, asked a few pointed questions, and reviewed the paperwork in silence for several minutes. Then, with the finality of a gavel before it even fell, she granted every motion Kelsey requested. No contact, no financial access, no more shadows where my life used to be. Before I narrate what happens next, let me know why you haven't subscribed yet. Brian's face twisted as the judge announced her ruling, but he didn't protest. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, likely damage control, while Brian stared at me like I was a puzzle he thought he'd already solved. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I left the courtroom with my shoulders squared and my silence intact, knowing that was what would undo him most. Outside the courthouse, Kelsey handed me a folder and a tired but satisfied smile. "We've bought you breathing room," she said, adjusting her coat against the wind. "He won't be able to touch anything without triggering legal consequences now." I nodded and thanked her, the weight of her words settling in slowly. For the first time in months, I wasn't running. I was standing still and the earth wasn't shaking beneath me. Back in the bookstore, Nadia greeted me with a hug that caught me off guard. "You look different," she said, stepping back to study me. "Taller somehow, like you left something heavy behind." I laughed, and the sound surprised both of us. I hadn't realized until then how tightly my voice had been coiled inside me, braced for the next collapse. Over the next week, I settled deeper into the quiet life I was building. I added warm blankets to my new apartment, found joy in secondhand mugs, and planted a tiny herb garden on the windowsill. I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop and started learning what peace actually sounded like. It wasn't silence, not really. It was a soft hum of a kettle, pages turning, the sound of your own breath when you aren't afraid of it. The absence of chaos wasn't emptiness, it was space to breathe. Then, just as things began to feel solid, a letter arrived without a return address. It was hand-delivered to the bookstore, in an unmarked envelope, my name written in precise block letters. I opened it in the back room while Nadia rearranged the front display, and inside was a single page. The handwriting was unfamiliar but controlled, and the message was chilling. "You think you've escaped, but he's not done yet." My stomach dropped as I stared at the paper, the edge of it trembling in my fingers. I scanned the store, but nothing seemed out of place, just the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of old paper. Nadia noticed the color draining from my face and rushed over. I handed her the letter without a word, and she read it with a sharp breath. "We need to report this," she said instantly, reaching for her phone. I nodded, unable to speak, heart pounding in my chest like a drum summoning a storm. The police took the letter seriously, especially with the no-contact order in place. They filed a report and advised me to stay vigilant, logging any further incidents. Officer Klein, a kind man with tired eyes and a quiet voice, suggested I consider a restraining order extension that covered third-party intimidation. "This is calculated," he said, tapping the letter with a gloved finger. "It's meant to rattle you without breaking the law." Yet, Kelsey wasn't surprised when I told her. "This is the escalation I warned you about," she said, already drafting new motions for the court. "But he's made a mistake. This crosses a line." I gave her the letter for evidence, watching her tuck it into a folder with the same calm as someone shelving a book. "He thinks fear will bring you back under his control," she added, "but all he's done is give us more to use against him." The next morning, Lena Hayes called me from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but some reckless part of me needed to know why she had reached out. Her voice was hesitant, soft around the edges, like someone used to rehearsing their words. "I'm not here to defend him," she said immediately, before I could speak. "But I think you need to know something, and I don't think you'll hear it from anyone else." We agreed to meet in a cafe near the waterfront, a public place with large windows and plenty of witnesses. I arrived early and took a seat by the door, my coat still damp from the drizzle outside. Lena entered exactly on time, her dark hair pulled back, eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She looked younger in person, but her movements were cautious, like someone who had just realized the rules of the game she'd been playing. She sat down without ordering, hands folded tightly on the table. "I didn't know he was married when we met," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he was divorced, that you had taken everything from him and left." I said nothing, letting her talk, watching her carefully. By the time I found out the truth, I was already invested, she admitted, shame coloring her voice. And then, he changed. She told me about the lies, the subtle manipulation, the way he mirrored her insecurities and turned them into dependencies. "It was like he studied me," she said, tears threatening but not falling. "He knew exactly what to say to make me feel seen, then exactly what to say to make me question myself. I believed her because I had lived it. Every word she spoke was a ghost I had already exorcised." She pulled a small folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "I found these in his desk when I was packing to leave," she said. Inside were printed emails, screenshots, transaction logs, evidence that he'd hired a private investigator months before Annabelle's death. He'd been watching me, preparing for the inheritance, planning his next move like a man mapping out a chess game. "He knew about the estate before you did," she whispered. "He was waiting for it." I felt like the air had left the room, but I kept my face calm. I thanked her, and for a moment, we just sat there. Two women who had believed the same man and were left cleaning up different kinds of wreckage. "I'm sorry," Lena said, her voice thick with regret. "I should have known sooner. I should have told you before now." "You did what you could," I said finally, because I could see that she had suffered too. Not in the same way, but enough. She stood to leave, pausing before she turned away. "Be careful," she said. "He's not angry because you left. He's angry because you left and didn't collapse." Then she was gone, swallowed by the gray street outside. When I handed the folder from Lena to Kelsey, she flipped through it with surgical focus, her lips pressing into a flat line. "This changes everything," she said, pulling out her legal pad and writing notes with fast, deliberate strokes. "These investigator invoices, the emails. He was tracking your financial movements before your aunt even passed." I felt a cold, hollow echo in my chest at her words, a reminder that this betrayal hadn't started with the money but with intent. "We can establish premeditation," Kelsey continued, not looking up. "He's not just reacting. He's been planning." The next step was filing for an evidentiary hearing that would allow us to formally introduce what Lena provided. Kelsey wanted to pursue both civil and potential criminal charges if we could connect the timeline to fraudulent activity. "I'll send this to the Financial Crimes Unit," she said. "At the very least, this could open an investigation." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the coffee cup I hadn't touched, the steam long gone but my nerves still raw. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling in my new apartment, the silence no longer peaceful but loaded. I kept hearing Lena's voice. "He's not angry because you left. He's angry because you left and didn't collapse." The phrase looped in my head like a haunting, a reminder that Brian's violence was strategic, not impulsive. I'd stopped playing my role in his story, and now he didn't know what to do with me. And people like Brian didn't like uncertainty. They liked control. 2 days later, I got a message from a blocked number. It wasn't threatening. Not exactly. It was a photo of our old apartment door, the number 3B clear in the frame, the timestamp only 20 minutes old. There was no caption, no sender. But I knew. Brian was circling. I sent the image to Kelsey immediately, and she forwarded it to Officer Klein, who agreed it was a clear violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the no-contact order. "He's playing a game of proximity," Klein said when he called, "trying to rattle you while staying just within legal lines. Don't engage, but document everything. If he escalates even slightly, we'll have cause to act." At work, Nadia noticed something was wrong before I said a word. "You've gone quiet again," she said gently, dusting the counter with a soft cloth. "I told her everything about Lena, the surveillance, the photo of the apartment. She didn't say much, just listened, then handed me a tiny keychain alarm shaped like a cat. 'It won't save the world,' she said, 'but sometimes noise is power.' The next night, I packed a small overnight bag and stayed at a hotel again, just in case. I didn't want to lead Brian to my new apartment. The thought that he might be watching. Waiting for a moment, I let my guard down, made my skin crawl. I double-checked the locks on the hotel door and jammed a chair beneath the handle before I let myself breathe. Trust was now a calculation, not a reflex. The police installed a camera on the building across from my old apartment as a precaution. I'd moved out weeks ago, but Brian didn't seem to understand that leaving meant leaving, not hiding. The footage caught him the next day, lingering across the street for almost half an hour. He wasn't doing anything overt, just standing there, looking up at the window like he expected a ghost to appear. That image, still and silent, unsettled me more than if he'd screamed threats. Kelsey filed a motion to convert the no contact into a permanent restraining order based on repeated circumstantial intimidation. The hearing was scheduled within the week, expedited by the accumulating evidence. Meanwhile, I started recording every phone call, every strange envelope, every unmarked vehicle I spotted lingering too long. I had learned how to become my own investigator. It wasn't how I wanted to live, but it was how I needed to survive, for now. During that same week, I received an email from Grace, my financial advisor. "We've traced suspicious login attempts to your holding accounts." It read. They were unsuccessful, but repeated and persistent, coming from an IP associated with a co-working space in your husband's known area. I forwarded it to Kelsey, whose reply was instant and full of fire. "He's going to bury himself in digital fingerprints," she said. "Let him keep digging." I stayed away from social media completely, shut down my old accounts, and opened new ones under alternate names for practical use. Every thread to my past became a liability, and every photo once posted now felt like a map. Erin helped me scrub search engine results, removing cached address listings and phone records wherever possible. "You're becoming a ghost," she said one night as we scrolled through databases. "A ghost with firepower." On the day of the restraining order hearing, the courtroom was warm despite the rain outside. Brian sat at the far end of the room, dressed like he was auditioning for remorse. Cheap suit, no tie, eyes cast downward like he was embarrassed. I saw the performance for what it was, a costume designed for sympathy. The judge didn't fall for it. Kelsey presented the timeline with clean, irrefutable logic, the photo evidence, the email logs, the pattern of behavior that had grown increasingly dangerous. Brian's lawyer tried to pivot, painting me as paranoid, suggesting stress from the inheritance had affected my perception. But the facts didn't lie. The investigators' invoices, the unauthorized access attempts, the repeated visits to my former residence, all of it formed a noose of his own making. The judge ruled swiftly, permanent restraining order granted, retroactive to the first incident, enforceable statewide. Brian would be required to complete a psychological evaluation before being eligible to contest it in the future. As we left the courthouse, Kelsey smiled for the first time in weeks. "This doesn't mean it's over," she said, "but it means he can't touch you without consequences." That night, I opened a bottle of wine with Erin and watched old movies until we fell asleep on the couch. Peace wasn't a state I trusted yet, but I was learning how to visit it. And each day that passed without a shadow at my door, I grew closer to calling it home. Spring crept in slowly, and with it came signs of renewal I hadn't expected to notice. The tree outside my new window budded tiny green leaves, and the bookstore filled with customers shedding their winter coats and asking for travel reads. I was still cautious, still alert to every strange glance or unexpected sound, but the tension that lived under my ribs had begun to loosen. I no longer flinched when someone knocked on the door. I was beginning to believe I might actually be safe. Lena emailed me again in mid-April, this time with a longer message and an apology I didn't expect to need. She told me she had relocated to another state and was starting therapy to untangle everything Brian had done to her. "It's hard to admit how deep he got into my head," she wrote, "but I'm working on it." She included a few more documents she'd found. Text messages from Brian to the investigator. Notes from a burner phone he'd hidden under the seat of her car. I forwarded everything to Kelsey, who added them to the growing file. "He's cooked," she said when we met later that week. At this point, the civil case is going to be the least of his problems. The police had opened a formal investigation into digital fraud and conspiracy to access protected financial assets. Kelsey was working closely with a financial crimes officer who confirmed the subpoena on the co-working spaces network had returned IP matches linked directly to Brian's devices. "Once they can tie him to a specific machine or location," she added, "we'll have enough to file federal charges." My stomach twisted, not from fear, but from the gravity of how far he'd been willing to go. It was hard not to feel haunted by that. I kept wondering if I'd missed signs in the early years, moments that could have spared me all this. There had been red flags, sure, but not bright ones. Subtle shades of control, passive-aggressive jabs disguised as jokes, silence used like a leash. He never yelled, never hit, never broke anything, but he'd broken me in 100 quiet ways. And I'd let him, because I thought that's what love did sometimes. Bruised you in private so it could hold you in public. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. Nadia gave me a leather-bound notebook with soft pages and a note inside that read, "Write until the noise is quiet." Most days I didn't know what to say, but I wrote anyway. Half thoughts, unfinished sentences, things I couldn't tell anyone else. I wrote about the night I first realized Brian had stopped loving me, about the first time I caught him in a lie and convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. I wrote about Annabelle, the aunt I never knew, and how her unexpected gift had forced me to see what I'd been surviving instead of living. Erin encouraged me to take a weekend trip, even if it was just upstate. "You need space without shadows," she said, booking the cabin herself before I could protest. I drove north on a Friday afternoon, my playlist full of music Brian used to hate, and the windows down to let the cold air sting my cheeks. The cabin was small and rustic, tucked into the woods like it belonged there, with a porch swing that faced a frozen lake just beginning to thaw. I sat outside that evening with tea in hand, listening to wind stir through bare branches and birds returning home. It took me 2 days to realize I hadn't checked my phone once. The signal was spotty, and I didn't care. I read 2 full novels, both about women who found power after being broken, and walked the perimeter of the lake until my legs ached. There was no fear in those woods, only quiet, and I began to understand that healing wasn't a lightning bolt. It was the slow return of trust in your own footsteps. I drove home on Sunday with the radio off, listening only to the engine and my own breath. When I returned, the bookstore was covered in paper hearts. Nadia had hosted a fundraiser for a local shelter while I was gone, and each heart had a handwritten note from a donor. One read, "For every woman starting over," and I felt tears rise before I could stop them. "You were missed," Nadia said, handing me a muffin and a hug. I was learning that some kinds of kindness weren't obligations, they were invitations. Grace called the next day with an update. The Swiss holding account was accessed again, she said. Only this time, it triggered a security lockout and flagged an attempt to bypass our encryption. I held my breath, waiting. "He used credentials tied to your old apartment's Wi-Fi. That's traceable now." She paused, then added, "This isn't just desperation. He thinks he still has time." But he didn't. Kelsey filed a formal complaint with federal cybercrime investigators, and a grand jury hearing was scheduled within the month. We were no longer just proving emotional abuse or manipulation. We were proving intentional theft, a plan built on lies and coded in keystrokes. Brian hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd tried to erase me while I was still breathing. And now, finally, the system was catching up to him. The day the indictment came down, I was shelving new arrivals. Fiction, mostly. Stories about new beginnings and quiet justice. My phone buzzed once, then twice, then stayed silent. I stepped into the break room and called Kelsey, who confirmed it with a grim kind of satisfaction. "He's been arrested," she said. "Wire fraud, attempted theft of protected assets, and conspiracy to impersonate a beneficiary. They found the burner phones, the forged documents, everything." I sat down hard in the break room chair, hands shaking as I stared at the floor. The final unraveling had begun. Brian Dalton, the man who once promised to build a life with me, was now facing a future defined by prison walls and supervised phone calls. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was tired. The news broke by noon, and the local paper ran a digital headline with his name bolded in capital letters. "Former retail manager indicted for wire fraud. Conspiracy in multi-million-dollar scheme." I stared at the screen, my own face, invisible in the article, but my story humming beneath every line. Nadia read it over my shoulder and squeezed my hand. "He doesn't own your story anymore," she said quietly. "Now it belongs to truth." That night, Erin brought over pizza and wine, and we sat on the floor of my apartment like college roommates. She read the article out loud in dramatic voices, giving the prosecutor a thick Boston accent and turning Brian into a bad soap opera villain. I laughed so hard I cried, the sound echoing in my small living room without shame. "You know," Erin said between bites, "this would make a hell of a book someday." I smiled and said nothing, but part of me tucked that idea away like a key I might someday use. Over the next few weeks, The case against Brian grew teeth. The investigators traced every fraudulent transfer attempt, each forged document, and even matched printer toner from Lena's files to his old office at the co-working space. Kelsey called me regularly, her voice crisp with confidence. "He underestimated how thorough we'd be," she said during one call. "He thought if he acted calm and clean-cut, no one would look past the surface. But his whole plan was stitched together with panic and arrogance." I still hadn't heard from Brian directly, but Lena forwarded a message his lawyer sent her. It was short, vague, and filled with implications, something about regret and misunderstandings and miscommunication. I didn't take the bait. Whatever he had to say now was not meant for healing. It was another trap disguised as apology. I didn't owe him forgiveness to feel free. Instead, I turned inward, focusing on the parts of my life that were finally blooming. I added 2 more shifts at the bookstore, not for the money, but because it gave me purpose. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering resume help and sitting in on financial literacy classes. The work grounded me, reminding me that survival stories weren't rare. They just didn't always get told. And slowly, people began to trust me with their own. One woman named Denise had just left a boyfriend who tracked her phone through a shared plan. Another, Maya, brought her kids to every session because she couldn't afford childcare, but still took notes like her life depended on it. I saw parts of myself in all of them, parts I'd forgotten, buried under years of compromise and soft-pedaled control. "You're stronger than you think," I told them every week. And slowly, I started believing that applied to me too. One afternoon, I returned home to find an envelope taped to my door. Not handwritten, not personal, but official. Inside was a court notice for Brian's preliminary hearing, scheduled 2 weeks out, and an invitation to submit a victim impact statement. I sat with it for a long time, the paper feeling heavier than it should. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend the system would speak for me. But another part, the part that had found her voice in whispered pages and donated journals, knew I had to speak. I worked on the statement for days, writing and deleting, drafting and discarding. I didn't want it to be a letter of rage or even sadness. I wanted it to be true. I wrote about how it felt to live with someone who needed you small, how silence became both weapon and defense. I wrote about waking up in a hospital bed after the inheritance was finalized and realizing my husband hadn't even called. I wrote about the day I stopped being afraid. When I submitted it, Kelsey called just to say she was proud. "Not everyone gets the chance to name what hurt them," she said, "but you just did it with clarity and grace. That's rare." I didn't cry on the phone. I waited until I was alone, holding the empty mug Aaron had given me that said "Choose You" in chipped gold letters. The morning of the hearing was rainy, and the courthouse steps were slick with mist. I wore a gray dress and boots, not to impress, but because I wanted to feel anchored. Erin came with me, her presence steady as ever, and Kelsey met us inside with a nod of calm readiness. Brian sat on the defense side in a suit that didn't fit quite right anymore, his face gaunt, hair trimmed too short. He looked nothing like the man I'd married, just a stranger in borrowed clothes, shrinking under fluorescent light. The judge read the charges aloud, her voice echoing in the courtroom like bells. When they asked if the prosecution wished to submit additional documentation, Kelsey handed over my statement without flinching. Brian glanced back only once, a flicker of something. Maybe shame, maybe nothing. I didn't look away. I held my chin up and imagined every woman who'd ever been called dramatic, irrational, too much, standing behind me in rows, silent and unflinching. Afterward, we walked out into the wet morning, umbrellas snapping in the breeze. I exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. "It's not over yet," Kelsey reminded me gently. "But it's close." I nodded, watching rain streak across the windshield as Aaron pulled the car around. Closure didn't come with handcuffs. It came with knowing you never needed the apology to heal. Later that week, I visited Annabelle's grave for the first time. The cemetery was quiet, tucked behind a stone church with moss-covered steps and wind chimes in the trees. I brought a bouquet of white tulips and the silver Mont Blanc pen Brian never received, the one that sat in a drawer, untouched. I laid both at her headstone and whispered, "Thank you," because she had seen something in me I hadn't seen in myself. She hadn't left me the money because I was special. She'd left it because I was ready to break the cycle, ready to rise, ready to use what she'd built to build something better. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rewriting the story she never got to finish. By early summer, the bookstore's front windows were lined with sun-faded fiction and potted lavender, and I found myself smiling more without realizing it. The quiet had returned, but it no longer carried the edge of fear. It was soft now, lived in. My apartment smelled like citrus and sandalwood instead of stale coffee and tension, and even my posture had changed. I wasn't hunched inward anymore. I took up space again, and I did it without apology. Grace called one afternoon with final confirmation. The estate was secure, and every asset had been transferred into a trust under my name alone. "There are no pending claims, no hidden liabilities," she said. "It's clean, Claire, and it's yours." I didn't know how to respond at first, the words feeling too big for my mouth. I walked to the park after the call, letting the early summer breeze wrap around my arms like a blanket. I sat on the same bench where I used to spiral, back when everything felt like it might fall apart with one wrong word. Now it felt like a monument to survival, to the versions of me that had carried us this far. I closed my eyes and let the sun soak into my skin. For the first time, I didn't brace for something to go wrong. That weekend, I returned to the cabin upstate, the same one Aaron had sent me 2 months ago. This time I went alone, not to hide, but to reflect. The lake was no longer frozen, its surface glassy and calm, mirroring the trees that surrounded it. I journaled each morning on the porch with coffee and birdsong as my soundtrack. The words came more easily now, less pain, more clarity. I wrote about Annabelle and her note. "You were the only one who never wanted anything from me." That line had haunted me at first, but now I understood what she meant. She had spent her life surrounded by people who saw her as a bank account, a brand, a stepping stone. I had just been a niece reading medical articles in a hospice room. Somehow, that had been enough. The cabin had no TV and barely any signal, which made it easier to tune out the noise of the world. I cooked for myself, read 3 novels in a row, and walked barefoot along the edge of the lake each evening. My body still bore scars from that winter, emotional ones, psychological ones, but they didn't sting as much now. I had survived Brian, and more importantly, I had survived who I'd been with him. I left the cabin on Sunday with a suitcase full of clean clothes and a mind clear enough to see forward. 2 days later, I received a letter from the district attorney's office. Brian had accepted a plea deal. He would serve a minimum of 6 years in federal prison, with additional time depending on restitution and court-mandated evaluations. Kelsey called to walk me through it, her tone measured but relieved. He didn't want a trial, she said. Too much evidence, and too much of the truth. I wasn't angry about the sentence. It wasn't about numbers for me. It was about accountability. I didn't need him to suffer. I just needed him out of my life. And now, finally, he was. The story I had lived in for too long had been closed, its ending written in black ink on court documents and wire fraud records. When I told Erin, she hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. "He's out of your world," she whispered. "He doesn't get to orbit you anymore." That night, she brought cupcakes and cheap champagne, and we toasted to beginnings rather than endings. We laughed so loud the neighbors banged on the ceiling, and we didn't even feel guilty. Joy, I was learning, didn't require permission. With the legal chaos behind me, I finally had the space to ask myself what I wanted from this new life. The bookstore was still a haven, but it wasn't enough anymore. I wanted to create something from the ruins. Not just heal, but build. I started looking into grants and spaces, talking to Nadia about expanding into community programming. "You're ready," she said, handing me the keys one morning when she had to leave early. "You're not just surviving anymore, you're leading." I used a portion of the inheritance to lease a second-floor space above a coffee shop around the corner. It had tall windows, exposed beams, and enough room for bookshelves, soft chairs, and a writing corner. I named it the Quiet Room, a space for women to write, think, read, and gather without expectation. There would be journaling workshops, story nights, and mentorship programs. It wasn't just a business. It was a declaration. The day we opened, I stood in the doorway with a mug of mint tea and watched as women filtered in. Some carried laptops, others notebooks, and a few just needed a place to sit without being watched or asked for anything. The air buzzed with gentle conversation and silent pages turning. A woman approached me around noon, maybe 40, with tired eyes and a hopeful smile. "I didn't think spaces like this existed," she said. "They do now," I replied. In late June, I received one last envelope, this one from Lena. Inside was a single photograph and a note. The photo showed the three of us at a conference from a year before everything fell apart. Me, Brian, and Lena, standing awkwardly near a table of brochures. My smile looked real, but my eyes didn't. The note said, "I wanted you to have this, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what you'll never be again." I pinned it inside a journal at the Quiet Room, beneath a quote that had become my favorite. "Sometimes the fire that burns you is the one that forges you." I didn't need to destroy the past. I just needed to make sure it didn't destroy me. And now it never could. The girl in the photo was gone. The woman who stood in her place had chosen herself. On the one-year anniversary of Annabelle's passing, I visited the ocean she once lived beside, guided only by an address she'd left in her trust documents. It was a quiet property nestled against the cliffs, a gray stone house with weather-beaten shutters and wild roses growing along the porch. I walked the perimeter slowly, letting my fingertips trace the salt-stained railings, the silence broken only by waves against rocks. The caretaker met me at the gate, an elderly man named Thomas, who remembered her as sharp-tongued but generous. He handed me a brass key with a knowing smile and said, "She wanted you to see the view she built her life around." The interior was preserved exactly as she'd left it. Sun-warmed wood floors, minimalist decor, and bookshelves that ran ceiling-high in every room. There were no family portraits, only landscapes and photographs of distant cities she must have loved. It wasn't lonely inside, though it felt deliberate, like every space had been designed for reflection. I found her writing desk overlooking the sea, a faded scarf still draped across the chair, and a worn leather notebook tucked into the drawer. On the first page in Annabelle's neat script was a single sentence: "There is no greater inheritance than freedom." I stayed for 3 days in that house, sleeping in the guest room with windows cracked open to let the sea air in. I walked the beach each morning, my toes digging into cold, wet sand, and each night I sat by the fireplace, reading the books she'd collected. There were marginal notes in some, comments about character arcs, predictions, frustrations with weak endings. I laughed once at her scrawled curse in the margin of a romance novel. "He doesn't deserve her." It felt like the most honest conversation we'd ever had. By the second night, I knew I would keep the house. Not as a prize, but as a tribute. I didn't need to move in full-time. My life was rooted now in the city, in the bookstore, in the Quiet Room. But this would be a place to return to, a retreat, a promise kept, a quiet echo of the woman who saw me when no one else did. I made arrangements with Thomas to maintain the property and promised I'd be back before fall. Back home, the summer passed in slow, golden moments. The Quiet Room became more than a reading space. It turned into a sanctuary for women rebuilding themselves. There were late-night poetry sessions, weekend grief circles, and one Tuesday where someone left handwritten affirmations tucked into every chair. A local journalist came by and wrote a glowing feature, and suddenly donations began arriving, each one attached to a story that felt like mine. We added a wall for photos and quotes, and above it hung a wooden sign that simply said, "Start here." One evening in July, Nadia called me to the back of the bookstore with an envelope she said had come in the mail without a return address. My heart jumped, old reflexes kicking in before I even touched it. But when I opened it, there was no threat inside, only a typed letter from Brian's sister, Allison. She said she'd heard what had happened, that she hadn't spoken to Brian since their father's funeral, and that she was sorry. Not for his actions, but for the time she didn't speak up when she could have. I wrote back, thanking her and saying I didn't hold her accountable. We were all taught silence in different ways. She replied once more, saying she was leaving Boston too, starting over in Vermont, and that she hoped I kept writing. That made me pause, because I had been writing more than ever in journals, on napkins, in the margins of donation receipts. And for the first time, I was thinking about putting the pieces together. Erin pushed me toward it, as only she could. "Claire," she said, holding up a stack of my notebook pages, "people need to read this. Not the sensational parts, the honest ones. The parts where you couldn't breathe, and the parts where you chose to try anyway." She offered to help organize everything, editing what needed polish and protecting what needed to stay raw. I didn't say yes right away, but I didn't say no either. By August, the federal court had finalized Brian's sentencing, 7 years in prison, followed by 3 years supervised release, with mandatory therapy and restitution obligations to be paid from frozen personal accounts. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I didn't need to see him again to believe he was gone. I had let go of needing a final scene because the story wasn't his anymore. When the leaves began turning in early September, I held the first printed draft of my manuscript in my hands. The title was simple: Inheritance. Not for the money, not for the property, but for the truths I carried now, the resilience, the clarity, the new beginning Annabelle had left in place of an apology. Erin cried when she read the dedication, "To every woman told she should be grateful for less." It wasn't just a book, it was a mirror. We hosted a small launch party at the Quiet Room, candles flickering in mason jars, plates of lemon bars and spiced tea on fold-out tables. Women came from the shelter, from the bookstore, from the community, all the people who had walked beside me without even knowing it. I didn't give a speech, just a thank you and a single quote. "Some storms break you open, others wash you clean." And with that, we celebrated not the end, but the return. That night, after everyone had gone and the room was still glowing with leftover light, I stood alone at the front window. The city hummed outside, soft and distant, and I realized I wasn't afraid of its noise anymore. I could still feel him sometimes, the phantom of who Brian had pretended to be, but it no longer lived in my body. It passed through like weather, and I no longer bent in the wind. I lit a single candle and placed it on the shelf next to Annabelle's notebook. Then I took the silver pen, the one I never gave to Brian, and wrote her name on the first page of a fresh journal. Below it, I wrote mine. And then, finally, I began the next story. Not one of survival, but of becoming. Thank you for listening to Claire's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.